Please take your seats so we can start the event. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Good afternoon, Excellencies, dear colleagues, distinguished guests. Welcome to this special event, which marks the second formal observance at the United Nations of the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, 19 June. It is an honor for Argentina to be hosting once again, together with the offices of the Special Representatives of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict and for Children and Armed Conflict, a special event in commemoration of this International Day. Allow me to express our deep appreciation to the permanent missions of Australia, Canada, Colombia, Liechtenstein, Mexico, the United States, and Uruguay, and to the delegation of the European Union for joining us in co-sponsoring this event. Today's commemoration is being transmitted live through webcast via UN Web TV and counts with interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. Also, please feel free to join us in tweeting live during the event using the hashtag #EndRapeInWar. Allow me to acknowledge the presence of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten, of the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, Virginia Gamba, of our distinguished panelists, as well as of the high-level representatives from co-sponsoring member states. Excellencies, colleagues, distinguished guests, we are gathered here today to commemorate the International Day, whose objectives are to raise awareness of the need to prevent, put an end, and fight impunity for crimes of conflict-related sexual violence, foster solidarity with the survivors of sexual violence around the world, and to pay tribute to all those who are courageously working on the front lines from the eradication of these crimes. The International Day was established by the General Assembly in 2015 through its Resolution 69/293, which was an initiative put forward by the government of Argentina, together with the offices of the then SRGs on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Mrs. Zainab Bangura, and for Children and Armed Conflict, Mrs. Leila Serugi. The resolution was adopted by consensus, but most importantly, the fact that it was co-sponsored by 114 member states was, and still is, a clear display of the relevance and importance of the subject and the need to prevent and eradicate these heinous crimes, promoting accountability and fighting impunity and providing all necessary assistance to its victims. The theme for this year's observance is preventing sexual violence crimes through justice and deterrence. We wanted to highlight on this occasion the aspects of prevention as well as those related to accountability, access to justice, and the fight against impunity. As displayed during the recent open debate on conflict-related sexual violence in the Security Council, it is more clear than ever that prevention and accountability are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. Changing from a culture of condemnation to a culture of deterrence through the provision of timely and adequate legal services, access to justice, accountability measures, and the fight against impunity for the perpetrators of these crimes are fundamental factors to comprehensively prevent these heinous acts from taking place. In that sense, it is imperative to shed a light to these crimes, which very often remain in the dark and sometimes are considered as a byproduct of war and conflict. For that, it is necessary to change that logic and generate one that imposes effective justice and accountability as a byproduct of sexual violence crimes. It is only by delivering that accountability and redress measures and ending impunity that we will be able to effectively prevent such crimes from taking place. Sexual violence in conflict is a despicable phenomenon that not only affects international peace and security, it is a human right as well as gender issue, a scourge that affects every society and prevents its full and sustainable development, as well as the dignity, integrity, and human rights of each individual. We hope that today's event will help us in reflecting about this issue and the necessary steps and measures that are needed for putting an end to these crimes. With that, I thank you and welcome you all to today's panel, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce a video message from the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to send greetings on the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. I would like to pay tribute to the survivors and express my solidarity with all those working to support them, often at great personal risk. Today's event on preventing sexual violence crimes through justice and deterrence compels us to reflect on the link between accountability and behavioral change. Prosecution is a form of prevention. Impunity means license to rape. Recent decades have seen major milestones in the quest for accountability. International and national courts have recognized sexual violence as a war crime, a crime against humanity, and an act of genocide. Nonetheless, we have yet to reach a tipping point where fear of accountability prevents women, girls, men, and boys falling prey to these grave crimes. We must continue to strive to change the cynical calculation that makes rape a convenient and effective weapon of war and terror. To prevent it, we must end impunity and change the social norms that blame and shame victims. And we must recognize that women are disproportionately vulnerable. Our response must be to deliver not just law, but justice. This means ensuring that women are better represented and respected in law enforcement and throughout the justice and security sector. It also means fostering equality and social justice in communities. For too many women, war lingers after its official end. It lives on in untreated physical and psychological trauma, social stigma, and unwanted pregnancies. These children, born of rape, are often ostracized. The consequences of sexual violence in conflict can echo across generations. But when justice is done, and is seen to be done, it can have great transformative power, the power to prevent. So today, I urge everyone concerned to work for the political will to end impunity for these vile crimes and promote justice, reparation, and healing for survivors. I thank you.
On behalf of the organizers and co-sponsors, we thank Mrs. Mohammed for her message. And now, my pleasure is to give the floor to the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Under Secretary General Pramila Patten. Prior to this appointment, and since 2003, Mrs. Patten served as a member of the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. She has been a member of several high-level panels and projects, including the High-Level Advisory Group for the Global Study on Implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security, and the Advisory Panel for the African Women's Rights Observatory within the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. She previously was a commissioner appointed by the UN Secretary General to the International Commission of Inquiry into Massacre in Guinea, Conakry of 28 September 2009. A national of Mauritius, she has been a practicing lawyer since 1982, and she also served as an advisor in the Ministry of Women's Rights, Child Development, and Family Welfare of Mauritius from 2004 to 2002 from 2000 to 2004. Mrs. Patten, you have the floor.
Thank you, Excellency. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to join this commemoration of the International Day to Eliminate Sexual Violence in Conflict. Quite appropriately, it is my first public event since assuming responsibility as Special Representative. I thank the Deputy Secretary General for her statement and look forward to joining hands with her in the sacred cause to eradicate this crime. I'm particularly grateful to the government of Argentina, represented today by Ambassador Martín García Moritán, for being a steadfast champion of this agenda and inaugurating the International Day in 2015. I'm also glad to co-host this event with my colleague Virginia Gamba, who is also recently appointed in her role as the Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, and with whom I hope to work in the strongest solidarity. I would also like to warmly welcome our co-panelist, Mr. Toussaint Muntazini, the prosecutor of the Special Criminal Court of the Central African Republic, Maître Amidou Tidjane Bal, judicial advisor in Guinea, and Mrs. Angela Maria Escobar, a human rights defender in Colombia. All of them are doing critical and groundbreaking work to drive accountability for these heinous crimes, and I look forward to learning from them. We convene today against the backdrop of a grim and unacceptable reality, that it is still largely cost-free to rape a woman, child, or man in many conflict situations around the world. This must change, and I believe that for the first time in history, we are on the cusp of reversing this reality. Since the establishment of this mandate by the United Nations Security Council, we have seen a fundamental transformation of the way this problem is understood, and on that basis, the manner in which it must be attacked. Conflict-related sexual violence is now viewed as a legitimate threat to maintenance of international peace and security that requires an operational security and justice response combined with comprehensive services for survivors. Among other things, this shift has led to the expansion of the circle of stakeholders beyond the traditional gender experts to now also engage uniform peacekeepers, mediators, ceasefire monitors, war crime prosecutors, and the full range of civilian protection actors. A robust legal framework is now in place to address conflict-related sexual violence, including a series of groundbreaking Security Council resolutions that establish a global regime to enforce compliance with international law and put in place a prevention framework. Exposing to the light of international scrutiny the impunity that has historically obscured these crimes, and ensuring that those who commit, command, or condone sexual violence are held to account is a critical aspect of deterrence and ultimately prevention. Over the past several years, we have indeed begun to see some accountability, from the first successful prosecutions of sexual violence crimes by the International Criminal Court to nationally driven accountability in places such as the DRC and Guinea. It is essential that we now build on this momentum to turn the tide once and for all on sexual violence used as a weapon of war and tactic of terrorism. The role played by the Security Council to shift the paradigm of response has been essential, as has been the steadfast support of many other member states through recent years. And as I take up the mantle of leadership for this mandate, I salute especially two inspirational women, my sisters in arms, Margot Wallström of Sweden and Zainab Bangura of Sierra Leone, whose leadership, vision, and relentless drive have also been critical to the progress we have witnessed. They have put us on the path of irrevocable change, and I pledge to do all in my power to build on the foundation that they have laid. But most of all, we are at this juncture because of the courage and resilience of the survivors and fearless activists who are on the daily front lines of this battle. This day of commemoration is about paying tribute to those who have faced the unimaginable horror of wartime rape and who have survived undiminished and undeterred. These survivors have many faces. The woman in a refugee camp in Kenya, 8 months pregnant, raped at gunpoint when she went to gather firewood. A Somali father, powerless to prevent the rapes of his daughters who were 4 and 6 years old. A male survivor of sexual violence from Bosnia, recounting the brutality he endured during the war and how 20 years later his rapist still walked free in their town. And small children in an orphanage in the DRC, abandoned by their mothers because they were born of rape and therefore seen as evil. I will never forget my own experience on the United Nations Commission of Inquiry to investigate the political violence that took place in Conakry, Guinea on 28 September 2009. I remember the many women who suffered sexual violence and came forward to the Commission to give their testimony, which enabled us to confirm that 109 women had suffered brutal rape, including several who died of their wounds from such assaults. Today, due to the tireless advocacy of victims' groups and civil society, and the support of the Office of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict to a panel of Guinean judges appointed by the government, we have seen 16 high-profile indictments, including that of the former president of Guinea, Moussa Dadis Camara. Bal, I'm sure, will speak more about this case. This shows that justice may be delayed, but it can never be denied. It is a clarion call to all perpetrators and would-be perpetrators that none of them are above the law, and no woman, child, or man is beneath it. Indeed, it is through the systematic application of justice that we will convert cultures of impunity for sexual violent crimes into cultures of prevention. Sexual violence inflicts devastation not just on individuals, but on entire communities. It undermines the very possibility of reconciliation and peace. That is why we must stand in solidarity on this International Day to eliminate sexual violence in conflict, resolute in our collective determination to root out this evil by holding all perpetrators to account and meeting our sacred duty of care, services, and livelihood support for the survivors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Patten, for your remarks. And now, it's my pleasure to give the floor to my friend and second keynote speaker, the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflicts, Under Secretary General Virginia Gamba. Prior to her designation, Mrs. Gamba was Assistant Secretary General and head of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, United Nations Joint Investigative Mechanism established by Security Council Resolution 2235, 2015, on the use of chemicals as weapons in Syria. A national of Argentina, Mrs. Gamba brings more than 30 years of experience and she started very young. Years of experience and professional leadership on issues relative to disarmament, peace, and human security. Among her vast experience, she was director and deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs in the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs 2012-2015, deputy director of Safety and Security at the Institute for Public Safety of the Ministry of Justice of the Government of the City of Buenos Aires, 2009-2012, and expert consultant for the European Union to assist the African Union with the development of the implementation strategy for the African Common Approach to combat illicit small arms trafficking. She holds a Master of Science degree in Strategic Studies from the University College of Wales and a Bachelor of Arts in Spanish and American Studies from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. Mrs. Gamba, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank Ambassador Martín García Moritán, Permanent Representative of Argentina, my country, Mr. Christian Buenavesser, the Permanent Representatives of Liechtenstein, my colleague, Mrs. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Sexual Violence in Conflict, as well as the co-sponsoring member states and the distinguished panelists who will enlighten us today with their experience and advice. I am deeply honored to be amongst you to commemorate the 3rd International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict for the 2nd time, and to discuss how we can overcome violations by means of justice and deterrence. Today is an important opportunity to raise broad awareness on the issue of sexual violence in conflict and pay tribute to the survivors of these crimes, those overcoming the profound social, physical, and psychological consequences of these atrocities deserve our utmost respect and unfaltering support. Moreover, today should also serve as a reminder that we must never accept sexual violence as an inevitable phenomenon of war, and prompt us to take decisive and coordinated action to end and prevent these violations. It is our collective duty, our responsibility, to better protect those most vulnerable in times of war, afford survivors of sexual violence all possible assistance to reclaim their lives, and hold perpetrators to account. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, with regards to my mandate, which focuses on children and armed conflict, rape and other forms of sexual violence represent one of the 6 grave violations against children. Since the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1882 in 2009, the violation has become a trigger for listing parties to armed conflict in the annexes of the Secretary General's annual report on children and armed conflict. The process serves the dual purpose of publicly holding perpetrators to account for their crimes, as well as creating the political space to engage them in view of ending and preventing future violations. All too often, reports of conflict-related sexual violence against children reach my office. In the Secretary General's report covering the period of 2015, for example, 14 parties were listed for rape and other forms of sexual violence, including 12 armed groups and 2 government forces, and sexual violence affected children in 16 out of 20 conflict situations on the Children and Armed Conflict agenda which I hold. Notwithstanding these figures, as cases of sexual violence are particularly difficult to document and verify, the actual magnitude of violations is almost certainly underreported. We will never know exactly how many. While there is a developing consensus among member states that sexual violence against children must be stopped, and progress has been made in the area of accountability, it remains a central concern in the majority of situations of armed conflict that we follow. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, even in peacetime, children are an easy target for perpetrators of sexual violence. Their vulnerability is, however, further compounded during war, when traditional protective structures such as families, schools, and religious institutions disintegrate. Armed conflict also often diminishes the capacity of justice systems aimed at holding perpetrators to account. When soldiers or elements of armed groups operate in such contexts, acts of rape and sexual violence against children often become commonplace and can set in motion cycles of retaliation. Bolstering protective structures and breaking the chain of impunity by investigating crimes and holding perpetrators to account must therefore be the cornerstone of any effort to prevent acts of sexual violence. Ensuring accountability for crimes of sexual violence in conflict is, however, a very delicate and complicated undertaking. Feelings of guilt and shame, fear of retaliation or stigma, pushes boys and girls to avoid speaking about the abuses endured, and survivors of sexual violence often remain the invisible victims. Before justice can prevail, we must therefore first establish safe spaces which allow children to overcome their fear, speak out on their experiences, and testify in court. Judges and prosecutors must be trained in dealing with cases of conflict-related violence and recognize the importance of ensuring the best interest of the child above all else. And communities must be equipped to receive child survivors and understand that the stigmatization of sexual violence must end. There is a strong correlation between violations perpetrated by government forces and armed groups. 8 of the 12 armed groups listed for rape and sexual violence in the annexes of the latest annual report on children and armed conflict operate in countries where government forces are listed for the same violation. Encouraging governments to hold their own troops to account, including through the implementation of action plans, technical support to local justice systems, and joint advocacy, is an important prerequisite to break the cycle of impunity. In this regard, it is very positive that listed government forces in our books have signed action plans which cover sexual violence against children. We must build on this achievement to overcome impunity and replace it with a culture of justice. Ladies and gentlemen, in a few moments we will be seeing a short video on the plight of Khadija, a 17-year-old girl who was abducted by Boko Haram in Nigeria and suffered unspeakable atrocities at the hands of her captors. Even following her rescue by the Nigerian military, she continued to suffer the consequences of her abuse, not least because she was publicly stigmatized as being a Boko Haram wife. The story also illustrates that sexual violence does not only traumatize survivors, but can also have serious repercussions on broader societal cohesion and thus can and will impact reconciliation. As the Secretary General mentioned yesterday in his message on the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, each and every one of us has a responsibility to help put a stop to these crimes. We owe it to survivors such as Khadija to ensure that they receive support to overcome their trauma, receive appropriate reparations, and can reclaim their rightful place as full members of society. Today, let's renew our shared commitment and ensure that child survivors of sexual violence will be given the means and support to rebuild their lives, and they will receive the justice they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for your remarks. And with this, that concludes our opening segment. And we will now move on to the panel. But first, we would like to play a video by UNICEF about conflict-related sexual violence by Boko Haram in Nigeria.
Na ce ni ba zan yi aure ba ko za ku kashe ni, sai da daddare suka zo da su da yawa suka zo suka ɗauke ni suka gudu da ni. Da suka gudu da ni ina zaune sun aje ni a wani gida sun kulle ni. Na kai wata ɗaya kafin aka zo aka ce ko kin so ko kin ki babu mun riga mun ɗora aurenki. Ba na iya yin magana cikin su, don ba sa jin Hausa. Wani lokaci ina magana, inda wayansu kuma ba ma shiri da suna zagi na matan Boko Haram. Wannan ya bige ni tanan, wannan ya tire ni tanan, ke matan Boko Haram ki aje mana kayan mu. In na ɗauka roba zan wanke kayan yaro na, za su ce mun matan Boko Haram ba za ki wanki da roban mu ba. Ina je wajen ruwa ko ina na je matan Boko Haram ake zagi na. Wani lokaci ina tashi da farin ciki, wani kuma da bakin ciki. Ba sa zagi na kamar na da, amma wani lokaci suna zagi na. Ina roƙon Allah ya kawo mun iyayena ne.
Well, thank you very much, and it is now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have Mr. Toussaint Moutassini, who is the Special Prosecutor for the Special Criminal Court of the Central African Republic. Before that, he was the Director of the Military Attorney General Office of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where he was also the focal point for cooperation with international criminal courts. Mr. Moutassini played a major role not only in the development of legal instruments to facilitate the interaction of Congolese military justice with the ICC, but also in the completion of proceedings regarding international crimes in the DRC. Mr. Moutassini, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you first and foremost for providing me with this opportunity, the opportunity to speak before this assembly. I am just taking up my position as Special Prosecutor to the Special Criminal Court of the Central African Republic. I have listened carefully to the statements which preceded me, and I think there's a very strong link between prevention of sexual-based violence and accountability. And I'm even more convinced of this because of my experience in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There we have seen that the path to achieve accountability is a long road, but it's a road that can be followed if you are determined. This is because sexual violence, as noted previously, is a global issue which affects human rights, which affects legality between men and women, or equality between men and women, and which hinders sustainable development. And it's also an issue for the dignity of people. And that's why in the programs which we have established in the DRC, we have decided to give priority to sexual violence. This was not easy, especially given the context in my country. There is a certain taboo regarding sex. So when you talk about sexual violence, then victims are afraid of being stigmatized. Victims are afraid of reprisals, and victims are afraid of being rejected by their communities. So the first task had to be carried out to help victims, to raise awareness amongst them so that they can have courage in order to break this silence. So we launched a slogan at the time, which was aimed at victims, and we told them, "Put an end to silence before silence breaks you." And it's a campaign which took time to take effect and to give results. But it's a campaign which was determined and which went alongside with other capacity building activities, in particular in the judicial system. This is because, as you know, my country was emerging from a time of war. It is still in a post-conflict situation, and the judiciary was quite comprehensively destroyed. Legislation in terms of sexual violence was obsolete, and it did not reflect the progress made in international law on sexual violence. But through legal instruments ratified in our country, we were able to find gaps, and in those gaps directly apply provisions, in particular on human rights, in order to consider sexual violence when committed in conflict situations as a war crime or as a crime against humanity. So within this task, we were supported by the international community, in particular by the United Nations system. We're supported by specialized bodies as well, such as the Office of Ms. Bongola, whose replacement is to my left here, who played a very strong role in capacity building. In this regard, we were able to set up what we called support cells for prosecution. And these were set up in order to support military justice systems in the Congo, which was suffering from technical issues, suffering from operational difficulties as well, and also human resource issues. So we needed training in place, and we needed capacity building activities, and in particular for military justice officials. At the same time, we also had to work with the army commanders. We believed that people in uniform were an issue at the time because they committed sexual violence, but they also had to be part of the solution to this problem. So we were able to involve those responsible in the army and to have them sign commitments so that the army could better collaborate with the justice and legal system so that we could bring to justice those who are committing acts of sexual violence. So all of these activities brought us to improve our results in order to prosecute sexual violence. For example, in 2014, we saw an interaction between these prosecution cells and military justice, and this progressively led to a reduction in the acts of sexual violence. We went from 60 cases of sexual violence involving 14 officials in 2015 to 55 cases of sexual violence involving just 8 officers at the end of 2016. So this was made possible because we decided to set up a mechanism to give priority to certain cases. Within this mechanism, we placed particular emphasis on sexual violence. We believed that sexual violence was a serious crime because it affected human dignity, it destroyed people's bodies, it destabilized communities, and it hindered development. So this process to assign priority to cases was the will of those involved in the justice system themselves. So we set out a mapping of the various crimes committed throughout the territory, and this mapping enabled us to identify trends, enabled us to identify those responsible, and enabled us to also identify partners who could come in to support this process. So we were able to set up a consultation collaboration framework, not just with the United Nations bodies, but also with NGOs who are involved in this sector. So we're able to implement pathways for collaboration to ensure a kind of pooling of our efforts in this regard. There was a lack of resources, so we had to effectively streamline the use of these available resources. And that's how, by identifying different partners, I would see who could contribute with regards to their own expertise and provide tangible support. For example, by organizing protection of victims and witnesses, organizing training, and even setting up specialized teams in order to investigate sexual crimes. So teams integrated into this investigation into sexual violence, including medical proof. We also set up mechanisms for monitoring and assessment to see whether this mechanism to assign priority to cases was having a positive impact. We were able to see that this mechanism was having an impact. So this experience in the DRC, we hope to apply to the CAR as well. As the Special Prosecutor for the Special Criminal Court in the CAR, we've seen that the situation is similar as that experience in the DRC. The people of the CAR have decided to set up a jurisdiction following the widespread crimes committed in the country. There is documentation available which the court can rely on, in particular the wrapping of the United Nations carried out 2 weeks ago. And this report shows that there are certain strong trends in terms of the use of sexual violence as a war crime. There are challenges for the CAR. There is an issue regarding the lack of state authority. There is also an issue with regards to a lack of resources and certain cultural situations, stigmatization of victims, the need to raise awareness amongst victims, and the need to protect them so that they can effectively take part in the judicial process. But the Special Criminal Court is based on principles of complementarity and will work in conjunction with the International Criminal Court and with national jurisdictions. In this manner, we want to ensure that this will cover as many people as possible. It's a hybrid jurisdiction which will set up a principle of complementarity which is unprecedented, because when you look at the Rome Statute, you can see that the International Criminal Court is complementary with national jurisdictions. But for the Special Criminal Court in CAR, the International Criminal Court will work in conjunction with the Special Criminal Court. That court in the country will have primacy over national investigations. So based on our experience in the DRC and with the cooperation of the United Nations system and NGOs on the ground, we'll ensure that the prosecutions by the Special Criminal Court will be as effective as possible. Thank you very much.
Merci, monsieur.
I'd like to thank Mr. Muntasini for his statement.
The next panelist, Mr. Ahmed Tidiane Bal. Mr. Bal is a former Minister of Justice and President of the Supreme Court of Mauritania and a senior legal advisor for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Burundi. Since December 2012, he has been deployed to Guinea Conakry by the UN team of experts, rule of law, sexual violence in conflict, to assist the government of Guinea, and in particular the panel of judges appointed to investigate the crimes committed around 28 September 2009, with a particular focus on sexual violence crimes. The basis for his work is a joint communiqué signed in November 2011 by the Guinean government and the United Nations. Mr. Bal, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. I'm pleased to be here today and to talk to you about this issue of preventing conflict-related sexual violence. And I think it's always better to prevent rather than cure, all the more so now when it comes to conflict-related sexual violence. We were on the ground and we saw clear manifestations of this problem, and the lack of prevention for us came first of all through the lack of clear laws that would enable us to punish such offenses. And the panel of judges that I am supervising found itself dealing with particularly difficult situations and how to manage people's fear. And why was this? Well, because there is no, and there was no, as far as we were concerned, any clear laws with clear provisions providing punishment for these crimes. So much so that on the 28th of September, dealing with the 28th of September situation, the panel of judges from the outset prosecuted offenses of a sexual nature using only rape, with no distinction whatsoever between the most heinous situations, the specific situations, and the types of sexual attacks, the different types of victims. And the judges found themselves without the resources to deal with these attacks in details. So you can well appreciate these were the major obstacles that we had to deal with, and that had to do with the criminalization of this. And whenever we talk about prevention, we have to look at the purely legislative aspect of it. Are there clear provisions that enable us, when there is such an offense of this type, to tackle them usefully? And we are on the ground. And believe me when I say that it is no easy task for us, because obviously we always have to come back to the sacrosanct principle of law, whereby the criminal law is subject to restrictive interpretation. And we also say that we must also have adequate criminalization, and the principle of legality must be respected. But all of this is predicated on the fact that we are already in possession of clear rules and laws. We experienced this problem, especially when it came to hearing the victims of rape. They would come and say they were raped, and we would say, how? Well, they would begin to hesitate for moral and cultural reasons, and then they would eventually come up with the most fanciful kind of scenarios, if not purely negative. How were you raped? Well, something was inserted into me somewhere. Where exactly? And then they would begin to hesitate. So that's what we face daily as experts on the ground. And obviously, for more than 5 years now, I've been trying to apply the provisions and the conclusions, the findings of Ms. Patten when she was part of the pool of experts in the Commission of Inquiry, but also in the joint communique from Madam Wallström, when the Guinean authorities did, however, commit to shedding light on these sexual attacks, sexual crimes, and support the panel of judges, which was done. But very often it was hard for them to do so. And the experts here can tell you to what extent sometimes we were disappointed, deeply disappointed to see that no progress was made. But there were other times when we were pleased with the outcomes, but it was no easy task for us. So I wanted to come back to the issue of prevention now. And I did say to you that when it comes to criminalizing the crime, we have to make sure that we provide clear guidance. But we were eventually relieved because Guinea did sign on to the Rome Statute, setting up the International Criminal Court. And among the provisions, states are compelled to introduce provisions of the Rome Statute, which made it possible to have them come up with more useful qualifications of these crimes. But it also led to certain problems. I am a judge by training, and if I were on the defense, I would have said probably there's a problem of non-retroactivity. but we also know the characteristics of international crime. So there is a debate here. So the provision of evidence has to be real, and it must show clearly what the elements of the crime are. However, we also need to want a fair trial, and we have to take into account the concerns of both parties. Still on prevention now. If the victim was assured that the crime would be properly punished, perhaps victims would be more courageous in bringing the crime to our attention. But the problem that we faced very often in Guinea was that very often the victims would not come forward. They would say, no, there's no point to doing it, and the person will not be punished anyway. But we can't discount all these arguments, and this discourages victims because they know very often that the perpetrators are highly placed and can't necessarily be brought to justice. And we did see cases where a simple sergeant would refuse to report to the summons of the civil judge because he felt that the army was above civil authority. So it is for reasons like this why prevention is important, and all of these aspects have to be decided upon upstream. So let me leave it at that because I know that there's a great deal more that can be said. But the final recommendation I'd like to make is that if we want to have efficient justice, we must make sure that we have a sound legal basis, and we also must make sure that we have proper judicial remedies. But this must also, more importantly, come through a clear political will to deliver justice, and there must be a will to combat impunity in whatever form it comes. Thank you. I'd like to thank Mr. Val for that intervention.
But not least, we have Mrs. Angela Maria Escobar. La señora Escobar es defensora.
Ms. Escobar is a defender of the rights of the people of Colombia and national coordinator for the Association Network of Women Victims and Professionals of Colombia. It's an association with more than 600 members, all victims of sexual violence, and a presence in 11 departments in Colombia. Angela Maria has led processes in order to support women and girls who have been victims of sexual violence so they can have access to justice, and has also carried out policies to put an end to sexual violence and recruitment of girls in various institutions and in various regions. She took part in conversations in Havana based on her experience as a victim on gender-based violence in various capacities. Ms. Escobar, you have the floor. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. As noted, I am Angela Maria. I'm a victim of sexual violence within armed conflict and national coordinator of the Association Network of Women Victims and Professionals. We have more than 600 members and provide support, and we strive to empower women who have been victims to ensure that women can have a voice, our own voice, so that we can raise our heads with dignity and to show that society and to families and to institutions that we are not those to blame. We also work to provide access to justice to women and to prevent sexual justice and its stigmatization. It is a pride for me to be here today as a victim of sexual violence from a conflict which we are now emerging from. Colombia, as you know, is a country which, after more than 50 years of war, is finally in a peace-building process, a peace which we hope will mean not just an end to conflict, but also an opportunity to eradicate sexual violence and eradicate it from spaces in which it has been protected. Especially, we need to ensure that this is eradicated in schools and in homes and public spaces. The International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict gives me an opportunity to pay tribute to all victims of these crimes. People like me who have now spoken up. We should not remain silent nor be stigmatized. I'd like to pay tribute to all those who, before being disappeared, were tortured and then killed and raped. I would like to reiterate our status as survivors, because we are not just victims. Being a victim is a legal status in Argentina, which means that we have won a battle, and in Colombia as well. But this was not bad luck. We're victims because someone decided to attack us. It's not because we're at the wrong place at the wrong time. It's not an accident. It's not an earthquake. It's not a flood. Sexual violence is not an accident. It is a crime in which there is a victim and someone who's responsible. It's a crime in which victims do not have the possibility of taking a decision, of deciding what the person responsible does with our body. They exercise power, masculine power over us. But this is a weapon which they use to oppress. But we are victims, but we are not responsible, and we should not feel shame, because shame and guilt just gives more power to those perpetrators. I'd like to share with you my experience, which enabled me to recognize myself as a victim of a crime of which no one wants to talk about and which no one wants to hear about, because people feel shame for us as well. Women and girls continue to be citizens of a lesser status. This crime shows that the abuse of power has no limits and which can reach incredibly cruel areas. Here I'm speaking to you because I was victim of something, but I was unable to be empowered and to move from victim to part of a collective process in which, with other victims, we have decided to raise our heads. We decided to take justice, a justice which did not stigmatize, which did not insist that it's victims that need to prove that they are innocent, and which prosecutes without victimizing once again. But first and foremost, which does this in a way which makes it clear to perpetrators, to institutions, and to society that sexual violence is not a cultural practice. It is a crime which cannot be justified and which needs to be sanctioned. Justice is the best way to prevent sexual violence, because if it is effective, it makes it clear to society that this crime will not be tolerated. We have learnt that justice is a right. We shouldn't wait for divine intervention. The state needs to guarantee our rights and to guarantee that victims can have a secure sphere in which they are listened to and in which our confusions are heard, so that we are not made to feel like we are to blame due to certain attitudes. We don't need to be asked how long rapes were lasted for. We need to be able to have a justice system which provides us with true justice. Therefore, we designed a model of a collective justice in which we build capacity for those officials, and we help victims as well in order to access justice. We need to identify the difference between transitional justice and other forms of justice. We need to denounce sexual justice and injustice, and this has been a significant step in order to raise awareness within citizens. As victims, we need to do this, but also we need to do this for institutions and society as a whole. By making these crimes public, we have generated solidarity for our cause. Some university students created a certain group and now write stories, make it easier to read about and understand the multiple aspects of this crime. These stories are used by ourselves to promote the fact that sexual violence needs to be spoken about in various political, university and literary spheres. Many 745 victims have taken part in certain forums in which we have shared our experiences and instrumentalized our work through Law 1719 of 2014, which strove to guarantee access to justice in our country for victims of sexual violence in armed conflict. This law took on the negative experiences of women who had sought justice and aims to eradicate obstacles to accessing justice for these victims. It was the first law which set out sexual violence as a crime against humanity in Colombia. And this was key for the participation of women in the peace process. As you know, the Colombian peace agreement is the first one that had a gender-based focus and which included sexual violence as a crime which cannot be accepted. This was possible thanks to the participation of ourselves as victims and our organizations and women's organizations. Women and our rights are included in the agreement. This generated attacks from those who believe that women should have no rights or that they should be included just within the family. So this was attacked, and there was propaganda against the gender-based focus and the rights of women within this agreement. There are attacks against those who are playing an important role in the implementation of the special jurisdiction for peace. For the rights of women to be taken seriously, we need to have this reflected in institutional practices. But these attacks were not unexpected. Not all those enjoy the rights of women. Therefore, it's important to continue struggling and to have true laws which put an end to impunity and sexual violence, as showed by this law 1719, and officials that design policies which explicitly give priority to sexual violence. I spoke with political leaders and others who work in solidarity with us, because we need men and women who work to defend the rights of women, and in particular the victims of sexual violence. But we would also like to pay tribute to all you here today, because you have the same commitment as us, because this is a very valuable commitment. Today, when we support the right to justice, the right to peace and the rights of victims of sexual violence, we need to generate debate, and we need to work tirelessly in this regard and work together to promote peace and love. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Ángela María. Muchas gracias por...
Thank you very much, Ángela María. Thank you very much for your strength and for your work against this horrendous crime.
Thank our distinguished panelists for sharing their insights and experience. Now I would like to open the floor for some comments or questions to the panelists. Due to limited time, we will only be able to accommodate 7 delegations, and I will kindly ask you to limit your interventions to 2 minutes. First, I will give the floor to the distinguished DPR of the European Union delegation.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the panel for their interventions. The EU and its member states reaffirm our strong and enduring commitment to eradicating sexual violence in conflict, together with all forms of violence and discrimination. Sexual violence is a flagrant and unacceptable violation of human rights, which targets the dignity and worth of a person and those close to her or him. We stand in solidarity with the victims and survivors of sexual violence in conflict, as well as their families. We also emphasise the continued importance of a holistic approach which addresses sexual violence in conflict as part of the broader women, peace and security agenda, recognising that sexual and gender-based violence are also the results of gender inequalities and of women's subordinated positions in too many parts of the world. We should avoid fragmentation and selective approaches. While sexual and gender-based violence predominantly targets women and girls, men and boys are also among the primary and secondary victims. We fully support the Secretary-General's focus on conflict prevention, of which elimination of sexual and gender-based violence forms an integrated part that is in line also with our own EU global strategy for foreign and security policy. We remain determined to lead by example. We know that accountability starts at home, and in this spirit, we have launched a series of actions in 2017 to combat violence against women and girls in all its forms in the European Union. we have allocated robust financial support for grassroots efforts to prevent gender-based violence and support its victims in the EU. The EU has also continued to implement concrete initiatives around the world to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. The EU Madad Trust Fund launched the biggest EU response package ever to the Syrian refugee crisis. Among other components, the programme strengthens access to protection from sexual and gender-based violence to at least 700,000 Syrian refugees and IDPs in neighbouring countries. A significant EU project is underway to help ensure that transitional justice processes in Kosovo, Colombia and the Philippines are tackling past abuses against women. We've maintained a strong focus on combating sexual and gender-based violence in humanitarian settings. In 2016, EU humanitarian aid for the prevention of and response to sexual and gender-based violence reached almost 3.4 million beneficiaries in 84 different projects. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union. Y ahora le doy la palabra al...
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative, permanent representative of Spain. You have the floor, sir. Thank you very much, Ambassador of Argentina, and to the other co-sponsors of this event. And all my congratulations to Pramila and Virginia for being here today, both of you together, sending a clear message to UN membership. I'll make three brief comments and a final conclusion. My first comment is that as Virginia and Pramila, you have an important common denominator. You have small offices, unfortunately, very clear mandates, and huge challenges ahead of you. And you also have a delegation that you can always count on, and that's Spain. And we will support you against any attempt to reduce the budgets for peacekeeping operations, which have to do with preventing sexual conflict, violence and conflict. That's very important. And the message you send cannot be any clearer. And the second thought I wanted to share is that you know that Spain was recently in the Security Council, and one of our major priorities was conflict-related sexual violence, and that's why we adopted Resolution 2321, which is trafficking in persons and sexual violence and conflict. And my concrete proposal for Pramila is as follows. Unfortunately, we have not had much time to explain this very complex resolution to the membership, and that is why I would suggest, Pramila, that when your agenda allows you, we can sit down together before the membership and explain the ins and outs of this resolution, which was supported by the 15 members of the Security Council at the time. And the third comment I wish to make is that Spain recently launched a major network of focal points on women, peace and security, and that meeting was in Alicante, and I was privileged to attend it, and it really was a success. And my concrete proposal for the others who will organize meetings of focal points on women, peace and security is that at some point they need to deal with conflict-related sexual violence. And my final comment is geared towards Angela Maria, and I listened closely to your strong testimony and your experiences. And we in Spain have contributed a relatively significant amount to coming up with a comprehensive instrument on the young women, and I promise you that I will gear my efforts towards making sure that we earmark more funds to care for victims of conflict-related sexual violence who deserve treatment equivalent to victims of terrorism. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco al distinguido representante.
To thank the distinguished permanent representative of Spain for that statement.
To the distinguished DPR of Australia.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and also pass my thanks to the panel, including Pramila and Virginia. It's very good to hear both of you. Also to hear very much from first-hand experience from Angela Maria. Thank you very much for sharing. I know this is it's very valuable for us to hear directly, but not an easy subject to talk about. In general terms, we very much as well look at women as often being the victims of sexual violence, but also not just victims. We need to see women also as powerful agents of change and also look to harness their capacity through greater participation in conflict prevention, resolution, rebuilding and reconciliation. And we also believe that the promotion of gender equality and empowerment of women and girls is fundamental to efforts aimed at preventing and addressing sexual violence in conflict. We must also address the underlying gender norms that enable sexual violence to be used as a tactic of war, torture or terrorism, and address the shame and stigma associated with such crimes for victims. I also want to highlight the valuable contribution of civil society in addressing these crimes, including activists and, again, groups on the ground, for example, as we've heard in Colombia, and particularly women's organisations. Your groups are very powerful in actually being agents of change. In order to do our part, Australia is supporting Justice Rapid Response, the UK's Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict initiative, as well as the International Criminal Court's Trust Fund for Victims and the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria. Coming back to the main theme, we think that Amina Mohammed in her address put it very succinctly. Impunity is a licence to rape. Moving away from what outsiders can do, states themselves have the primary obligation to investigate and prosecute sexual violence crimes themselves. And this requires, as a couple of speakers have said, the criminalisation of sexual violence in all its manifestations. Yet this alone is not sufficient, and victims of sexual violence must be provided with equal access to justice. Measures must be adopted to encourage victims and witnesses to testify and to protect those who do so. And this includes sustained access to sexual and reproductive health services, psychological, legal and livelihood support. In conclusion, even the most sophisticated criminal justice systems will be of little use if political will is lacking. There's also a requirement for good reporting of sexual violence and also trained investigators who are able to gather necessary evidence to sustain prosecutions. And where national jurisdictions are unable to or unwilling to prosecute, the International Criminal Court may have a role to play. On this, the third anniversary of the International Day, we would like to commend the ICC, together with other tribunals, on the leadership you've demonstrated in seeking to ensure that crimes of sexual violence are not neglected in the fight against impunity. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada, and now give the floor to distinguido representante.
The distinguished representative of Colombia, or deputy distinguished representative of Colombia. Thank you very much, Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank the Special Representative Pramila Patten, Virginia Gamba, and Martín García for organising this event, which, along with other countries, we co-sponsored with enthusiasm and with determination. Colombia would like to recognise the support of the Secretary-General and in particular the Office of the Special Representative for its work to support victims of sexual violence in Colombia. We really value the event today and the statements by the panelists, with particular recognition to our compatriot, Ms. Ángela María Escobar Vázquez, for her testimonial and her courage, really, which has moved us and moves us to continue working to help victims of sexual violence in armed conflict. As you know, and has been mentioned by Ángela María, the final peace agreement of last year established a Truth and Reconciliation and Peace Committee, identifying crimes of sexual violence committed during the conflict, identifying them as conflicts which cannot be subject to an amnesty. Therefore, we need to condemn all those who committed these and to provide reparations to victims. In terms of a normative framework in Colombia, we have taken an important step with the passing of a constitutional amendment in Congress with regards to peace, and which sets out a unity to investigate into cases of sexual violence. Colombia recognizes the contributions of civil society, in particular women's organizations, and what they provided to the agenda in terms of human rights and Ankara Maria's testimonial today shows this, and they really contribute to the peace process in Colombia. These are organizations which contribute and help the government to implement mechanisms which are effectively providing early warning and the prevention of sexual violence. We reiterate the commitment of our country to the victims of sexual violence and to all women, in particular providing reparations to victims of these crimes and establishing guarantees of the non-repetition of these crimes and their prevention. Thank you. I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Colombia for his statement.
The distinguished EPR of Japan, please, and I request if you can be as brief as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And at the outset, I would like to thank the presence of the Pramila Patten and Virginia Gamba. As well, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to the panelists for the very strong presentations. So we believe that prevention is the key word for the activities of the United Nations, and sexual violence is one of the crimes against humanity which should be prevented. So from today's discussion, it is quite clear that fighting against impunity and realizing accountability will lead to the prevention. So last year, we saw several cases in this area. For instance, the National Court in Guatemala convicted 2 former military officers in February. So I believe that these cases will be a sort of clue to change the culture of impunity and that the deterrence against the perpetrators will be strengthened. However, it is a matter of grave concern to us that nobody from the Islamic State, which is a grave perpetrator of sexual violence, has been prosecuted. So I think that we have not reached the tipping point yet. Last but not least, Japan has been supporting the activities of the team of experts, and their activities are supported by their small number of donors. So Japan will continue its support, and we would like to call upon the others to join the donors. I thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
I thank you, and I now give the floor to the distinguished PR of Korea.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your leadership, and also thank you for all participants for their inspiring and touching testimony. I can say that despite some advances, conflict-related sexual violence persists around the globe, which requires more coordinated action with reinforced focus and determination. Having said that, I have 3 points to make. First, perpetrators must be held accountable to end the persistent culture of impunity. In this vein, we note the significance of ICC's first ever judgment for sexual violence last year. Second, victims' perspectives should be reflected throughout the process of addressing sexual violence cases. Third, in the long term, social and cultural norms that will deter conflict-related sexual violence should be fostered through education and awareness raising. The Republic of Korea will continue to contribute to capacity building of government and women and girls in fragile and conflict-affected states through its development cooperation program. Korea also will continue to play a leading role in Peace Building Commission as a current chair, recognizing that peace building and sustaining peace efforts can contribute to preventing conflict-related sexual violence by addressing its root causes, and also contribute to the social cohesion and reconciliation in the process of post-conflict recovery. We believe that sustaining peace is not just the absence of violence. Rather, sustaining peace should be a state where all women, particularly adolescent girls and young women, could enjoy human dignity and live happily without any sense of fear and vulnerability. Finally, Korea would like to bring your attention on the education for global citizenship. With its focus on human dignity, mutual respect, understanding, tolerance, diversity, and sense of belonging, together with the compassion and empathy, we believe that education for global citizenship can be a useful tool to achieve long-term prevention and deterrence and eventually preserve human dignity. Thank you, Ambassador.
I thank you, and now I give the floor to the representative of Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Canada thanks Argentina for its role in establishing the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence and Conflict, and for organizing today's event. We are very proud to be a co-sponsor. We also thank the panelists and the discussants for their powerful statements today. Mr. Chair, so much could be said on this issue, but so much has been said, and recognizing the time is short, perhaps I will just limit myself to one point that we feel bears reiteration. In commemoration of International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence and Conflict, Canada wants all survivors of such violence to know that any shame associated with the despicable mistreatment that they have suffered rests not with them, but squarely with their abusers. We pledge our full support to those whose rights have been violated and are focused on putting gender and women back at the center of our efforts to build and sustain peace and achieve full accountability for perpetrators of sexual violence, exploitation, and abuse. With that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the panelists and discussants today for their words, but more importantly, their actions on this important issue.
I thank the representative of Canada for his statement, and I will give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Hungary.
Thank you very much.
And please be very brief.
It was already 1 second now, right?
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like very much to thank all the panelists and the keynote speakers and the sponsors of this very important meeting. Just 3 thoughts on behalf of Hungary as we align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. One is about stigmas. We very much believe that we have to end the silence. What is around this very important topic? As long as rape remains invisible and shameful, recovery is impossible and the recurrence of such crimes is inevitable. Stigmas can kill, not only by untreated infections and injuries of the victims, but by lethal retaliation such as honor crimes, suicide, and unsafe abortion. So we would like to stress the focus on our attention on the empowerment of the victims. Because of that, we very much believe in the importance of awareness raising and education, both on national and global level. Hungary is an active contributor to initiatives combating sexual violence in conflict, and the Hungarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade is just organizing an awareness-raising international workshop this summer on women, peace and security for experts on the relevant ministries, army, police, peacekeeping personnel, and interested civil society organizations and academics on this topic. And finally, we very much believe in the accountability. Setting up effective accountability mechanisms are vital in the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. This is why Hungary provided a voluntary contribution for the joint UN Women and Justice Rapid Response Project aimed at securing accountability for sexual and gender-based crimes. I thank you very much, Mr. President. And as we say nowadays.
Thank you for your brief statement and very important statement. And I give the floor to the permanent representative of Maldives. I'm sorry. I give the floor to the permanent representative of Myanmar.
Thank you very much. At the outset, the delegation of Myanmar wishes to express appreciation to you, Mr. Chair, and all the panelists for organizing this important event. Mr. Chair, in response to the request of the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflicts, the Mission of Myanmar provided adequate information on sexual violence in conflict. However, it is regrettable that this information has been ignored and not been reflected in the report. Mr. Chair, many positive developments have taken place since the 9th October incidents when well-organized terrorist attacks occurred against Myanmar border guards along the border with Myanmar and Bangladesh. These attacks were deliberate and aimed to target sovereignty, peace, and security of our country. Consequently, the national security forces had to take careful security clearance for the security of the region. With regard to the serious allegations of sexual violence and rape in the Rakhine State mentioned in the OHCHR flash report issued in March, we would like to quote the State Councillor when she emphasized that where there is clear evidence of abuses and violations, the government of Myanmar will take necessary measures, including bringing justice to the victims. Myanmar welcomes constructive criticisms, but negative allegations will not help to improve the true situation on the ground. The indigenous Rakhines and the Muslim community had been harmoniously living together in Rakhine State before the incidents, and the government is working hard to return to normalcy. Humanitarian access has been granted to UN agencies and other NGOs in all areas of Rakhine State. Mr. Chair, next I would like to point out the UN photograph posted on the UN webpage on the background linked to the message of the Secretary General on the occasion of the International Day of Sexual Violence in Conflict. We viewed this with...
Excuse me. Can you have one more minute? Only one.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes. My delegation is deeply disappointed in this caption, implying sexual abuses against children who are supposed to be from the camp of Rakhine State. We view this as an act of prejudice, and by singling out a country like this, it could cause misunderstanding and prejudgment by the viewers. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Myanmar for the intervention, and I thank all delegations for their interventions, and I apologize for not being able to accommodate more interventions on such an important occasion. And to end this event, and thanking you all for your presence and participation, I will pass the floor to Ambassador Christian Wenawebser, Permanent Representative of Liechtenstein to the UN, to deliver some concluding remarks. Ambassador Christian, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Martin. We are obviously over time. That will be very brief. I just want to make 4 points. The first is to thank you for taking the initiative to give us an opportunity to dedicate at least a couple of hours to this very important phenomenon, and to do this in the presence of the UN mechanisms that are dealing with this. We obviously hope that this is a sustainable effort, but we would really like to thank you for highlighting this today. Second, impunity and the role of justice, I think, has been a constant element in the presentations today, and that's a point that I really want to emphasize very strongly. It came out very strongly in Amina's opening remarks, but other speakers have emphasized it. I think it's a good moment to also remind ourselves that international criminal justice has made enormous progress in this respect in the past decades. There was in the ICTR, there was a groundbreaking case that said that rape can be a form of genocide in the Akayesu case, and the International Criminal Court has had a policy focus on the issue of sexual violence that we believe to be extremely important. We therefore hope that we will give consistent, strong support to accountability mechanisms such as the ICC, such as the Syria accountability mechanism, which has very strong language in its terms of reference on sexual violence as well. My third point is on sexual violence against males and boys, men and boys. We do believe that this is an underreported and an under-discussed topic, and we are very happy to be part of the effort to put this higher on the agenda as our part of our overall effort to both eradicate this scourge, but also to the overall agenda of gender equality. And finally, point made by our Australian colleague that we believe to be very important is we should not look at women in particular only as victims in this discussion, but also to look at them as agents of change and to look at empowering them in this discussion. So with these brief thoughts, I would like to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank our panelists in particular the mandate holders. They are both new to their task. We very much look forward to working with them. And thank you, Martín, in particular, again, for doing this.
Well, thank you very much for your attendance and your participation, panelists. And, well, the meeting is adjourned.